Jack and Tu Tien sit on their open veranda with 2 bowls of soup and a basket of baby clothes, a neighbor pressed into their hands for later. The house is finally steady, the road is finished, the grass is growing, but one question will not stay silent. Are they ready to bring a child into this life after all the years of rented rooms, company trouble, and nights waiting alone? They do not answer with big speeches, only with small steps, clearing a spare room, washing tiny shirts, reordering work and money, learning to be less afraid. If you want to follow love told in this quiet, honest way, stay close and subscribe for the next nights with Jack and Tu Tien. By late afternoon, the light on the hill turned softer and thinner. It slid across the packed earth yard, climbed the red tiles of the veranda, and stopped at the dark line of the brick archway that opened into the house. The yard was still rough in places, with stones and small clumps of grass, but the new turf was settling. Near the step, 2 dogs slept, paws twitching now and then. On the low bamboo table stood 2 bowls of soup, steam fading in the cooling air. A plate of boiled greens rested beside a small dish of salt and pepper with a wedge of lime. Chopsticks lay across the rims of the bowls, neat and parallel. Under the brick wall, a basket of baby clothes sat just inside the veranda, folded in small, careful stacks, colors soft and slightly faded from many washes in another house. Tu Tien wiped the edge of the table with a damp cloth, pushing away a stray grain of rice. The smell of broth and boiled vegetables lingered around her. From the outdoor stove near the kitchen counter, the kettle gave a low hiss, each time steam slipped out from under its lid, then settled again. That sound had become the pulse of the house. The engine of Jack's car came up the concrete road that curved to the side of the house. Gravel crunched. Then the engine fell silent. She heard the short beep as he locked the car, the thud of the door closing, and then his steps on the hard ground. He appeared from behind the brick archway of the driveway, carrying 2 bags in one hand and a smaller plastic bag in the other. Dust clung to his trouser legs. His shirt was creased at the elbows. He raised the bags a little when he saw her. "I'm back," he said. She nodded, watching him set the bags down near the outdoor sink. His movements were slower than in the morning. He turned on the tap, held his hands under the cold water, scrubbed the dust away, then took the small towel she had hung there and dried his fingers carefully, pressing each one. "What did you bring?" she asked, voice quiet. "Medicine for Mom," he said, tapping one bag. "Some dry food, fish sauce, salt, a few things for here." He glanced past her shoulder. His eyes landed on the basket of tiny clothes. The sight seemed to interrupt whatever sentence he had been about to say next. He only closed his mouth and moved to sit on the bamboo stool opposite her. The kettle hissed again. She went to lower the fire a little, sliding one piece of wood aside with the toe of her slipper. When she came back, Jack was still looking toward the basket. It was the only new thing on the veranda since the morning. "The neighbor came by?" he asked. "She did," Tu Tien answered, sitting down. "She brought those. Said her youngest outgrew them. Told us to keep them. Said we can use them later." Jack placed one elbow on the table, then seemed to remember his manners and drew his arm back. He picked up his chopsticks instead. "Soup will cool," she said. "Eat while it is still warm." They ate a few spoonfuls in silence. The broth tasted of bone and ginger. The sound of their spoons touching the ceramic bowls filled the gaps between the dog's slow breathing and the shrill cry of an insect in the grass. The house felt steady in that small rhythm. "How is the grass in the yard?" Jack asked after a while, chewing a piece of vegetable. "Better than last week," she replied. "The pieces you laid are taking root. I watered them twice today. The soil is still loose in some places, but it will settle." He nodded. "And the puppies?" he asked. "They found a hole under the bamboo fence," she said. "I patched it with some old bricks. They still try to dig, but they cannot get through for now." He smiled at that, eyes softening. "Any new shoots in the vegetable bed?" he asked. "The mustard greens are up," she said. "The row near the path is thicker. The row at the back is thinner. Maybe the soil there is too hard. We can add compost later," he said. "Do not bend too much. How is your back?" She shifted a little on the stool. "It aches in the afternoon," she admitted. "But it is not too bad. I rest between rows." Jack lifted his bowl, drank the last of the broth, then set it down with care so it did not knock against the table. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then stopped and reached for the cloth by habit instead. "I saw the sticky rice soaking," he said. "You did that this morning?" She nodded. "You eat better when there is sticky rice," she said simply. "So I soaked it. Tomorrow morning it will be ready." He watched her for a moment. His gaze drifted again to the basket. The small clothes lay folded, sleeves tucked in, buttons fastened. A little yellow shirt sat on top, thin from many washes, but clean and smelling faintly of soap. She rose to clear the bowls. When she bent down to pick up the plate of greens, her hand reached toward the basket without thinking. Her fingers brushed the edge of the top shirt. She lifted it, held it in the air for a second, the fabric hanging weightless from her hand. The shirt was small enough to fit on one palm. She ran her thumb along the row of buttons. Her chest tightened in a way she did not name. She smoothed the front of the shirt once, then folded it back into the basket, aligning it with the others. "You know what she said?" Tu Tien murmured, still standing by the basket. "What?" Jack asked. "She said we should hurry," Tu Tien answered. "So those clothes will not wait too long." She tried to make her voice light, but it came out thin. Jack stayed silent. The kettle hissed again in the background, a steady whisper. "People here always talk like that," she added, half turning toward him, half toward the dogs. "They see a young couple. They say things. They mean well." His gaze did not leave her hand, which still rested on the edge of the basket. "Did you feel bothered?" he asked. She shook her head, then hesitated. "No," she said. "Only, I do not know." He shifted on his stool. For once, he did not reach for practicality. He only clasped his hands together, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale. "Do you think she was joking?" he asked quietly. "Or serious?" Tu Tien gave a small, tired smile. "I think both," she said. "She is happy when she gives things. She also wants to see a child running around here." He drew in a breath. The air on the veranda felt denser now, though the evening breeze had begun to move through the hanging bamboo baskets. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you think?" She did not answer. Instead, she carried the bowls toward the sink, stacked them in the metal basin, and turned on the tap. Water rushed and splashed, then settled into a lower stream. She washed each bowl with slow, circular motions. Her mind ran ahead of her hands. He stood up and brought the plate and chopsticks over, placing them beside her. For a moment they stood close, shoulder to shoulder, the sound of water between them. "Tien," he said. She kept her eyes on the bowl. "Yes?" His voice lowered. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Not as a joke, not because neighbors talk, just between us." She shut off the tap. The sudden silence made the kettle's hiss grow louder. "Ask," she said. "When you look at those clothes," he said, nodding toward the basket, "when you think about a child, do you want that now? With this house, this farm, this life as it is?" The question hung in the air. It was not heavy because of the words alone, but because of everything that lay behind them. The years they had waited, the rooms they had rented, the nights they had spent counting money. Tu Tien dried her hands on the cloth and walked back to the veranda. She sat down again, facing the basket. Jack remained standing a moment, then took his seat across from her, hands resting flat on his knees. She reached for the kettle, lifted it off the stove, and brought it to the table. The metal was warm against her palm. She set out the teapot and 3 cups on a small tray. 2 they always used, 1 spare. She poured tea into his cup, then into her own. Steam rose in thin lines and vanished. She lifted the third empty cup, turned it in her fingers, then set it on the tray as well. She did not pour tea into it. She only left it there, an empty space. Her gaze stayed on that empty cup when she spoke. "I think of it," she said slowly. "Of course I do. But a child is not only a wish, it is work. From the first day until we cannot move anymore." He listened, eyes steady. "We have this house now," she went on. "We have land. We have a place for animals, for vegetables. But our hearts," she paused, searching for the right word, "our hearts are still learning how to rest. I do not want to bring a child in if we still carry too much fear." Jack leaned forward a little. "What fear?" he asked softly. "The fear that you will be called away again," she said. "That work will swallow you. That money will run thin if something bad happens. That one of us gets sick. That I cannot carry well, cannot give birth well. That the house becomes full of worry instead of laughter." She did not raise her voice on any of those words. She laid each one down with the same quiet tone she used when putting bowls back on the shelf. Jack's fingers tapped once against his knee, then stilled. "I did not know you thought about it so clearly," he said. "I do not say everything," she replied. "I do not want to add weight to your mind when you already have many things." He looked at the third cup on the tray. It sat between them, empty, catching a faint line of light along its rim. "There is one thing I know," he said after a moment. "I do not want you to carry this fear alone. If we ever decide to have a child, it must be a decision we both stand behind, the same way we stood behind building this house." She nodded. Her throat felt tight. She took her cup and sipped the tea. It was already cooling, but the warmth still spread slowly down. "A shared meal is a small kind of promise," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Maybe a child is the biggest meal we will ever cook." He gave a short breath that almost became a laugh, then fell back into quiet. "I will think," she said, "not only about fear, but about what I truly want. Tonight, maybe I will not sleep early." "Think," he answered. "Take your time. We do not need to answer the neighbor. We only need to answer ourselves." Outside, the hills darkened. A thin chill came into the yard. Jack stood and went to close the gate at the end of the new concrete path. The latch clicked once, marking the boundary between the farm and the road. When he returned, Tu Tien was still at the table. The dogs had shifted closer to the step, fur ruffled by the light wind. She reached out and adjusted the top shirt in the basket, aligning its edges with the ones beneath. Jack sat down again. Neither spoke. The kettle, now off the fire, gave one last soft hiss as the remaining steam slipped away. The empty cup stayed on the tray, untouched, holding nothing but the slow settling of the evening. That night, the house lay quiet behind the brick archway. The bulbs under the veranda were off. Only a small lamp in the corner of the bedroom gave a pale circle of light on the floorboards. Outside, crickets called in the grass. The slope of raw earth behind the house held the night air, still and cool. Tu Tien lay on her side, facing the window. Jack's breathing was steady behind her, his chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm that had taken years to obtain. She listened to it until the sound slipped into the background. Then another sound rose in her memory: rain on a metal roof. The room around her dissolved into an older room. Its walls were painted a tired white. The ceiling fan squeaked every few turns. Through the thin wall, a neighbor's television murmured. The window looked onto a narrow alley where laundry hung on lines crisscrossing overhead. In that room, a mattress sat on the floor, pressed against one wall. A pot and a gas stove occupied a corner. A plastic basin did double duty as sink and washing tub. The floor was marked with dark circles, where water had spilled and dried. She saw herself there, years younger, sitting cross-legged by the low table, a bowl of rice and a plate of fried egg in front of her. The sound of rain on the corrugated metal roof above beat in a steady, hard rhythm. It filled the space where a second pair of chopsticks should have been. Jack had called earlier to say he would be late. A problem at the site, a check on the formwork, a meeting with someone from the company. There were always reasons. He did not complain. His voice had been even. She had told him to eat something before coming home. The call had ended with that same promise he always made. "I will come back tonight." On the table, her phone lay face down. She picked it up, checked the time, then set it back down. She took a bite of egg that had gone cold. The rain drummed overhead, faster when the wind shifted. In that year, a fever meant unpaid days. A broken motorbike swallowed the money meant for rent. She had learned to count every coin before going to bed. She had also learned not to mention certain fears out loud. Words cost more than silence. Once, while scrubbing a small stain on the mattress cover, she had paused and pressed her hand flat against the fabric. A picture had entered her mind. A baby, lying where her palm rested. The thought had stayed for a moment, then receded as she rinsed the cloth. There had been nowhere to put a cradle in that room. No space for the restless movement of a small body at night. No balcony to stand on with a crying child. Only one window that opened onto the alley and the smell of other people's dinners. Poverty teaches people to count everything, even dreams. Another memory rose, the incident with the company. Jack had come home that night with his shoulders more rigid than usual. He had sat down on the edge of the mattress without taking off his shoes. His phone kept buzzing. He had silenced it and put it away. "They are checking all the documents," he had said. "Some beams, some concrete tests. If they find everything clean, it will be fine. If not, we will see." She had poured him tea in the same chipped cup he always used. His hands had wrapped around it, but he had not drunk. "You did your work carefully," she had said. "You always check." He had shaken his head. "It is not only me," he had answered. "There are juniors involved, decisions made above me. I cannot pretend I stand apart." Days turned into weeks. Meetings, inspections, rumors. Jack had taken calls at all hours. When the name Vin began to appear more often in his sentences, she had understood it was serious. There had been talk of signed reports, of missing checks, of pressure from people they had never met in person. In those months, whenever a neighbor's child came to visit their room, she had welcomed the distraction. Small feet had pattered on the faded tiles. Tiny fingers had grabbed her sleeve. She had lifted the child up, feeling the weight settle against her chest. For a brief moment, her room had felt full. Then the mother would call from the corridor, and the child would wriggle out of her arms and run away. The room would fall back into its usual quiet, the fan squeaking above, the rain or traffic outside. Jack had once watched a group of children kicking a dented ball at the end of their alley. He had stood at the doorway, hand resting on the frame, eyes fixed on the movement in front of him. Then his phone had buzzed, and he had turned away. She had heard him say, "I am coming," and knew he would not be home for dinner again. In those days, when conversation touched even lightly on families and future, one of them would break it off. She would mention raising more dogs instead. He would say they should first clear up this situation, secure work, maybe save enough to move somewhere with more air and less noise. There had been a night when the rain fell so hard that water pushed under the door, forming a shallow puddle near the entrance. They had rolled up trousers, taken rags, and pushed the water back. Their feet had been cold, their fingers pruned from contact with the dirty water. When they were done, they had sat down on overturned buckets, breathing hard. "Sometimes I think we are just walking from one storm to another," she had murmured. He had looked at her then, tired eyes softening. "Then we need better shelter," he had said. "Not just for us." He had not said "for a child" out loud. She had not asked him to. Later, when the worst of the company trouble had passed, and he had begun to speak of leaving, of starting his own work, of taking some of the team with him, his tone had changed. He had been cautious, but there had been a thread of quiet determination under his words. One evening, he had come home with a folded scrap of paper. Oil stains marked the edges. He had smoothed it out on the table. "This is nothing much," he had said, almost apologetic. "Just a thought I had while waiting at the site." She had leaned over the drawing. There had been a rectangle for a house, a square for a yard, lines for paths, small circles for trees. He had pointed to different parts as he spoke. "Here, a small oven built into the wall," he had said. "Here, a covered veranda. Here, a place for dogs. Maybe some vegetables along this side. And this box?" she had asked, touching a small square drawn next to the longer block of the house. He had hesitated. "That can be storage," he had said. "Or another room. Maybe one day, when our life is calmer, it can be something else." He had not named it, neither had she. But that small square had stayed in her mind for a long time. On the mattress in the present, she shifted slightly. Jack's arm moved with her, draping over her waist in his sleep. The room smelled of wood and detergent, and the faint smoke that clung to clothes after a day near the outdoor stove. She blinked, clearing the old images. The narrow alley, the squeaky fan, the rain on metal returned to their place at the back of her mind. The faint sound of night insects outside the farm's window took over again. The small square on the old drawing now existed in wood and brick. It stood a few steps from this bed, behind a simple door. At the moment, it held blankets, bags, some tools. It also held, in her mind, all the years they had postponed, all the times they had said later, while holding back something unnamed. She realized, lying there in the dark, that later was no longer somewhere far ahead. The house was built. The road reached the gate. The oven baked bread. The dogs had their corner. Her hands had soil to work and dough to knead every day. Fear remained, but it did not sit alone anymore. It shared space with a new feeling, a steady, quiet question that had stood on the veranda earlier, between an empty cup and a basket of small clothes. She closed her eyes and listened again to Jack's breathing. She did not know yet what her answer would be, but for the first time, she allowed herself to think of that small square, not as storage, not as an anonymous extra room, but as a place that might one day hold more than blankets. Outside, the hill kept its own silence. Somewhere down the valley, a dog barked once and then stopped. The house held the night without trouble. Inside, under the thin blanket, Tu Tien finally drifted into sleep, carrying both the memory of cramped rooms and the shape of a future she had never dared to draw out fully until now. In the early morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, the air over the farm was pale and cool. A thin mist hung around the tops of the bamboo. The slope of earth behind the house still carried the darkness of the night. The first sound inside was the low whistle of the kettle on the outdoor stove. It rose and fell, then rose again as the water neared boiling. Smoke from the small fire curled up and brushed the edge of the veranda roof. The smell of burning wood mixed with the faint scent of soaked rice. Jack woke to that sound and smell. He lay for a moment, staring at the wooden ceiling, then turned his head. The space beside him on the bed was empty. He could hear soft movements from the veranda. A bowl placed on the counter. A stool shifted a little across the tile. He sat up, pulled on a sweater, and stepped into the main room. The light entering through the brick archway of the front wall was still weak, but it picked out the lines of the bamboo table, the dark metal columns, the hanging baskets. Tu Tien stood near the edge of the veranda, a ladle in one hand. The steamer pot sat on the stove, its lid slightly tilted to let steam escape. Each time she lifted the lid, a cloud rose, carrying the warm, dense smell of sticky rice. The basket of baby clothes still rested near the step where it had been the evening before. "You are up early," he said. She looked over, smiled slightly. "I could not sleep much after dawn," she said. "The rice needed checking anyway." He walked to the outdoor sink, splashed his face with cold water, and dried it with the hand towel. The cold woke him fully. He turned back to her. "Did your back hurt?" he asked. "A little," she said. "The garden rows were long yesterday. It is better after I move around." He went to the stove, checked the fire, pushed a small piece of wood further in. "How about your sleep?" she asked, switching off the gas under the kettle and lifting it aside. "I slept," he said. "I thought too much before, but then sleep came." She removed the steamer from the pot and set it on a trivet. When she lifted the lid, the sight of the sticky rice filled the small space between them. White, plump grains, edges slightly translucent, steam rising in gentle puffs. He felt a simple gratitude for the scene. This stove, this woman, this morning that did not demand more than cooking and talking. They ate breakfast on the veranda, elbows close to their bodies against the chill. She placed a basket of sticky rice in the center, with small bowls of sesame salt and a plate of thinly sliced cucumber. They picked with their fingers, rolling the grains in the sesame mix. "Tell me honestly," Jack said, after they had eaten in silence for a while. "Are you very tired these days?" She took a moment before answering. "Some tasks are heavy," she said, "carrying water from the tank, bending in the beds, but I can still manage. If I feel too tired, I stop and sit on the step." He nodded slowly. "I have been rearranging my work," he said. "I did not tell you in detail before, because I was not sure, but I have decided to refuse some projects far away. From now on, I want to stay closer." She looked up at him. "That means less income," she said. "A little less," he admitted, "but enough," I calculated. "If we plan well, it is better to earn slightly less and come home every night than to chase higher pay and sleep in other people's rooms again." He broke off a piece of sticky rice, rolled it in the sesame, and thought about how to continue. "If one day we have a child here," he said, "I do not want that child to see me only on a screen or with a suitcase at the door." He had not spoken the word child out loud at breakfast before. It sat on the table as solidly as the bowl of sesame. Tu Tien set her food down. She wiped her fingers on the edge of her plate and folded her hands together. Her eyes remained on the table. "I am afraid," she said. "Of what?" he asked gently. "Of many things," she said. "Of carrying and losing. Of complications. Of doctors in town speaking words we do not fully understand. Of needing money we do not have. Of me not being strong enough. Of you being dragged away again by something you did not cause." Her voice stayed level, but her shoulders were stiff. "When you disappeared into that company trouble," she went on, "those weeks felt long. I kept thinking, if we had had a child then, I would have had to hold both my fear and the child's fear at the same time." He looked down, his thumb pressed against a spot on the table until the skin whitened. "I never wanted you to feel that alone," he said. "I know," she said, "but it happened. Our life then was too fragile. A small shock and everything shook. I am afraid of building on fragile ground again." He nodded once, accepting her words instead of defending himself. "At the same time," she continued, taking a breath, "this house feels patient. Sometimes, when you are away and I sit here with the dogs, I feel another space between us. The veranda, the oven, the yard, they all seem to wait for someone else to use them too." She gave a small laugh with no mockery in it. "It sounds strange," she said. "It does not," he replied. "I have felt it too." She lifted her gaze to him. For a few seconds, they looked at one another without speaking. The kettle, placed back on the stove for a later cup of tea, began to stir again in the background. "I do not know how to weigh these things," she said. "Fear on one side, quiet longing on the other. I do not know which is heavier." "We do not have to weigh them alone," he said. "We can turn them into steps instead of thoughts." She frowned lightly. "What steps?" she asked. He wiped his hands on a cloth and began to count on his fingers, not as a performance, but to make each point solid. First, he said, we go to town together. We find a doctor who explains things clearly. You do a full check of your health. If they say there is risk, we listen and decide again. If they say it is fine, we carry that knowledge instead of guessing. She listened, fingers now resting flat on the table. Second, he continued, we set aside money, a separate sum, not for bricks, not for tools, not for new plants, only for emergencies. We do not touch it unless it is truly needed. That way, if something happens, we have more than just hope. She nodded slowly. Third, he said, I adjust my work for real, not just in words. I already refused one distant project. I can reduce more. I speak with my team, build them up so they can stand without me watching every nail. I remember what happened with the company before. I do not want to repeat that mistake, and I do not want you to spend nights wondering if I will come home. He fell silent then, letting the list settle. And you? He asked. What steps would help you? She thought for a moment. I can speak with your mother, she said, not to announce anything, just to ask about her own pregnancies, what she ate, what she did, what she regrets, what she would repeat. She knows many things I do not. I have been shy to ask. Maybe it is time. He smiled faintly. She will be happy you trust her with those questions, he said. And I can also start to prepare this house, she added, not in a big way, just small things. Check which tasks could be done by someone else if one day I must stay in bed. Show you where I keep things, not just do everything myself. He realized how much of the house's order rested on her silent routines. Drawers, shelves, the way she folded linens, where she stored herbs and medicine. He saw how a change in her health would affect more than just her own body. Then we agree on something, he said. If, after these steps, you still feel the fear is too large, we wait. No pressure from family, no guilt. If instead you feel more ready, we move forward, but always together. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. That is fair, she said. He reached across the table, not to take her hand, but to adjust the small dish of sesame so it sat exactly between them. It was a habit of his, straightening shared objects. Preparation is another form of courage, he said quietly. She did not answer to that sentence directly. She only stood up and began to clear the table. He helped, carrying the bowls to the sink, rinsing them, placing them in a row to dry. Their movements were practiced, fitting into each other. Later that morning, they walked through the house. In the main room, he checked the hinges on the doors, adding a drop of oil to the ones that creaked. She folded blankets in a precise, repeated way, pressing air out before stacking them. In the outdoor kitchen, they moved some tools higher, away from the lower shelves. Finally, they stopped in front of the small room by the window. The door stuck slightly at first. Jack pressed his shoulder against it, and it opened with a short sound. Inside, the room smelled of fabric and cardboard. Sunlight came through the simple wooden window, making a bright rectangle on the floor. Along one wall, boxes were stacked. Old receipts, spare parts, some books, coils of rope. On a low shelf lay guest blankets, folded tight. A rolled-up mat rested in a corner. Jack stepped inside first, crouched, and opened one box. Inside were old clothes he no longer wore. He lifted them out and folded them into a neater pile. We do not need all of this, he said. Half can go to the charity shop in town. Tu Tien stood at the doorway, eyes traveling slowly over the walls, the ceiling, the window frame. She placed her hand on the sill. The wood was cool and slightly rough under her palm. If we clear this, he said without looking up, we do not have to call it anything yet. It can simply be an empty room. For your father if he visits. For Mom if she wants to stay a night. For later. He did not push further than that. She imagined, for a moment, a small bed by the window, a shelf with folded cloth, perhaps a mobile of simple wooden shapes hanging from the ceiling. She did not cling to the picture. She let it pass through her and rest somewhere behind her ribs. "We can start by moving the heavy things out," she said. "One box at a time. No rush." They carried 2 boxes together to the storage under the veranda. They shook out the mat and laid it flat under the bed in their own room. They refolded the blankets and placed them higher, freeing the lower shelf. By noon, the small room looked only slightly different. A bit emptier, a bit cleaner, but in their minds, a line had been crossed. It was no longer only a storage space. It was an answer in progress. In the afternoon, when the sun had climbed higher and the mist was gone, Tu Tien brought the basket of baby clothes to the outdoor sink. She filled a basin with clean water, added a small amount of soap, and began to wash each piece. Her hands moved with care. She rubbed the fabric between her fingers, rinsed it until the water ran clear, squeezed out the water without twisting too hard. Each shirt, each pair of trousers, each tiny hat passed through her grip. Jack came out carrying a length of rope and tied it between 2 posts at a lower height than the usual clothesline. He pulled it tight, testing its strength with both hands. "Here," he said, "it is easier for you to reach this one." She nodded, not stopping her washing. When she finished, she carried the basin to the line. He stood at one end, holding the rope steady. She pinned each garment carefully, spacing them so they would dry evenly. The little shirts hung in a neat row, wet and slightly heavy. The breeze caught their edges and made them sway. The smell of soap mixed with the smoke from the stove, where the kettle had begun to stir again for their afternoon tea. They did not discuss what washing those clothes meant. They did not call it preparation in words. They simply did it, side by side. The dogs wandered over and sniffed the basin, then lay down in a patch of sun near the steps. When the last piece of cloth was clipped to the rope, Tu Tien stepped back. Her hands were wrinkled from the water. Jack let go of the rope and stood beside her. "Looks clean," he said. "They will dry fast today," she replied. They stayed there for a little, watching the line. The light had changed since morning. It was stronger now, clearer. It touched the damp fabric, the rough ground, the worn surface of the bamboo stools on the veranda. Inside, the small room by the window waited, emptier than before. On the veranda, the kettle reached a soft boil. Its whistle began again, a familiar, modest sound that had accompanied so many of their days. Jack turned to the stove to lift it off the flame. Tu Tien went to the shelf to take down 2 cups. As she set them on the table, she hesitated, then took a 3rd cup and placed it next to them. She did not pour into it. She did not need to. The cup could stand empty for as long as it needed. Between the cups, the hanging clothes, and the cleared space in the small room, their decision was not yet fully formed, but it had begun to live in their actions. The morning had turned to noon, and noon was slowly turning toward afternoon. The farm held all of it without effort. In that ordinary flow, the 2 of them continued to move through their chores, one small, steady gesture at a time, leaving just enough room for another heartbeat to join them when the time was right.